2:15 p.m., 14 unidentified warships suddenly appear, and they're heading straight for destruction.
In less than 10 minutes, over 100 missiles could be in the air. Survival is not guaranteed.
What happened in the next 12 minutes turned the entire ocean into a battlefield of fire and steel.
2:15 in the afternoon. The South China Sea, USS Holly, and USS Stetham were not on a routine transit. 14 radar contacts were closing at 40 knots, and they were not answering the radio. The tropical air was thick with humidity and the sharp smell of salt spray. The sun beat down on the gray steel of the two destroyers as the crews moved to general quarters, the heavy thud of boots echoing through the narrow passageways. The bridge of the Holly was a hive of controlled intensity. The commanding officer stood near the center console, his eyes fixed on the blue light of the tactical display. To his left, the sensor operator adjusted his headset, his fingers moving across the glass screen with practiced speed. The 14 contacts were small, fast, and aggressive. They were moving in a staggered wedge formation, a swarm designed to overwhelm the sophisticated defenses of a modern warship. Bridge combat contacts are now at 12 miles and accelerating. A voice crackled over the internal comms. The commander did not blink. Still no response on the Brigetto Bridge. Negative, sir. We have hailed them on all international distress and hailing frequencies. They are running dark. No electronic signatures other than their surface search radars. The Holly and the Stetham were both Arleigh Burke-class destroyers designed to fight everything from submarines to ballistic missiles. But this was different. This was a knife fight in a crowded room. The 14 Chinese fast attack boats were Hube-class vessels. Each one was a small, high-speed catamaran armed with 8 anti-ship missiles. If they reached their launch range, they could saturate the air with over 100 missiles. The math was simple and lethal. The destroyers could not afford to let them get any closer. Set condition zebra throughout the ship, the commander ordered. Across the halls, heavy steel doors were swung shut and locked. The air conditioning hummed, struggling against the rising heat of the electronics and the bodies packed into the Combat Information Center. Deep in the hole, the gas turbine engines roared louder, pushing the ship to 30 knots. The wake behind the Holly turned into a mountain of white foam, slicing through the turquoise water of the South China Sea. On the horizon, the first faint glints of sunlight off metal appeared. The swarm was visible now. They were low-lung, camouflaged shapes jumping over the white caps. They looked like predators, small, but capable of a fatal bite. The distance was closing at a combined speed of over 70 knots. Warning shots, the executive officer asked, his voice low. No, the commander replied. They have crossed the line of departure. They are in a firing formation. If we wait for them to shoot first, we lose the ship. Inform the Stetham. We engage at 10 miles. The air on the bridge felt electric. The silence was broken only by the steady beep of the radar and the distant drone of the engines. Every sailor knew the stakes. They were 2,000 m from the nearest friendly port. Facing a force that had been built specifically to sink them, the Stetham moved into a supporting position 500 yards to the Holly's starboard quarter. The two ships were now a single tactical unit. On the decks of both vessels, the 5-inch guns swung around, their long barrels pointing toward the horizon like accusing fingers. Below the decks, in the Mark 41 vertical launch systems, the canisters held missiles that were already cooling their seeker heads, waiting for the command to fly. 10 miles, the sensor operator announced. The commander looked at the display one last time. The 14 dots were less than a minute away from their own optimal firing range. The time for talking had ended 10 minutes ago. Now it was about physics and steel combat bridge. You are cleared to engage all hostile contacts. Weapons free. The deck of the USS Holly shuddered. The first canister door on the forward Mark 41 vertical launch system blew open with a crack like a whip. A half-second later, a pillar of white-hot flame erupted from the deck. A RIM 162 Evolved Sea Sparrow missile cleared the rail, its booster screaming as it punched through the humid air. Then another and another. The sky above the two destroyers was suddenly cross-hatched with white smoke trails. The noise was deafening, a continuous physical weight that pressed against the chests of the sailors on the upper decks. The smell of burning solid rocket fuel, accurate, chemical, and searingly hot swept over the bridge as the Holly and the Stethem began their first offensive volley. On the horizon, the 14 Chinese fast attack boats were no longer just glints of light. They were distinct shapes, their camouflaged hulls cutting through the waves. They began to split their formation, fanning out to present smaller targets. They knew the missiles were coming. The distance was now 9 miles. Vampire! 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 The sensor operator shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. The lead Chinese boat had fired. A streak of fire leaped from its aft deck, followed immediately by another. The swarm was fighting back. They were pushing their systems to the absolute limit, launching their anti-ship cruise missiles while still at the outer edge of their effective range. The air between the two forces was now filled with supersonic steel, closing the distance in seconds. The Hoy's AMPY-6 radar tracked every incoming threat with clinical precision. The computer systems on both destroyers were talking to each other, handshaking at the speed of light, assigning targets, and calculating intercept solutions. This was the Aegis combat system at work, a digital brain coordinating a symphony of destruction. Engage tracks 1 through 4. The tactical action officer commanded. The 5-inch guns on both ships barked in unison. The heavy barrels recoiled with a violent mechanical thud, spitting out 70-pound shells at 3 times the speed of sound. The shock waves from the muzzle blasts rippled the water around the hulls, sending a fine mist of spray into the air. Each shell was programmed with a proximity fuse designed to explode in a cloud of tungsten fragments just before impact. The first American missiles reached the swarm. 7 miles away, a massive orange fireball bloomed over the water. The lead Hube-class boat took a direct hit from an Evolved Sea Sparrow missile. The catamaran hull, made of lightweight aluminum to save weight for speed, offered no resistance. The missile punched through the bridge and detonated inside the engine room. The boat did not just sink, it disintegrated. A cloud of black smoke and jagged burning debris was all that remained. As the following boats veered sharply to avoid the wreckage, Target 1 destroyed. Shifting to track 2, the Holly's weapon controller reported, the ocean was becoming a graveyard of burning oil and jagged metal. The remaining 13 boats did not slow down. They were coming on, their engines screaming at maximum revolutions per minute, their own missiles arching high into the sky before diving down toward the 2 American destroyers. The heat on the Holly's deck was rising. The vibration from the constant launches and gunshots made the deck plates dance under the sailors' feet. In the Combat Information Center, the light was dim, punctuated only by the glowing blue and red icons of the tactical display. The icons were moving closer together. The gap was now 6 miles. Incoming. Brace for shock, the commander yelled over the internal speakers. An incoming Chinese missile moving at nearly Mach 1 slammed into the water just 50 yards off the Holly's port. A mountain of gray water rose into the air, drenching the forward deck and the 5-inch gun mount. The ship rocked violently to the right, the steel groaning under the pressure of the near miss. No damage. Keep firing. The Stethem was now fully engaged. Its own forward and aft vertical launch systems spitting fire every 3 seconds. The 2 destroyers were surrounded by a wall of their own smoke and flame. 2 islands of American power in a sea that had turned into a furnace. 6M. They are within visual range of the 30mm cannons. The lookout reported his hands white-knuckled on his binoculars. The commander gripped the edge of the console. The next few minutes would decide everything. The swarm was smaller now, down to 11 active contacts, but they were closer and they were desperate. 5:45 in the afternoon, the South China Sea. The heat from the missile launches shimmered off the deck of the USS Holly in visible waves. The destroyer pivoted 10 degrees to the north, its hull cutting a deep white furrow in the dark water. The air on the bridge was a strange mix of freezing air conditioning and the sharp metallic tang of ozone. It was the smell of high-voltage electronics working at their absolute limit. Deep inside the ship, the tactical action officer stared at the Aegis display with unblinking eyes. The blue icons representing the two American destroyers remained steady and centered. The red icons of the Chinese swarm were flickering and erratic. Two more red dots vanished from the screen as the Stethem's 5-inch gun found its mark. The swarm was down to 9 boats. The tactical advantage was shifting, but the danger was not over. The remaining 9 vessels were not turning back. They were 5 miles away now, moving steadily into the kill zone of the 30mm cannons. Every sailor on board felt the vibration of the 4 gas turbine engines through the soles of their boots. The deck plates hummed with a low-frequency growl that never stopped. It was the sound of 12,000 tons of steel preparing for a final violent collision. On the Stetham, the forward Mark 41 vertical launch system hummed as the next bank of missile cells was selected by the computer. The crew in the magazine worked in absolute silence, their faces slick with sweat in the dim red tactical light. They knew the next 2 minutes would be the most dangerous of the entire engagement. The Chinese boats were spreading out even further now, trying to find a gap in the radar coverage or a blind spot in the destroyer's defensive arcs. The sea between the two forces was a chaotic mess of white foam, black oil smoke, and the orange glow of burning wreckage. Through the heavy bridge windows, the horizon was a jagged line of fire and salt spray. The commander gripped the arms of his command chair until his knuckles turned white. He could see the lead Chinese boat now through the long-range digital optics. It was a blur of gray and white, bouncing violently over the 2M swell. He could see the spray flying off its bow like a sheet of glass. He knew they were seconds away from another missile launch. The tension on the bridge was a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room. "Status on the Stetham?" the commander asked, his voice a low growl. "They're in position, sir. They have a clear line of sight on the southern group," the officer of the deck replied. Nobody else spoke. The only sound was the rapid clicking of keyboards and the steady rhythmic pulse of the sonar. The predator and the prey were now locked in a circle that was closing at 60 knots. The Holly's electronic warfare suite was screaming, detecting the terminal guidance radars of the incoming Chinese missiles. The ship's computers were working at the speed of light, throwing out chaff and flares to confuse the incoming seekers. Outside, the sky was torn apart by the white streaks of defensive missiles and the black puffs of exploding shells. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the water. The smell of the sea was gone, replaced entirely by the acrid stink of burnt powder and the hot, oily breath of the engines. "Bridge combat. We have a lock on the remaining 9, the tactical officer announced. The commander nodded once. He did not look away from the window. He could feel the ship leaning as it made a high-speed turn. The Hoy was a living thing now, responding to the commands of its crew with mechanical precision. The 30mm cannons on the port and starboard sides began to cycle, their barrels spinning up with a high-pitched whine that could be heard even through the armored hull. The distance was now 4 miles. The swarm was coming into the final reach. In the silence of the bridge, the commander could hear his own heart beating. He knew that in less than 60 seconds, the water around his ship would erupt in a storm of steel and fire. The tactical superiority they had worked for was about to be tested by the raw, brutal reality of close-quarters combat. For him out, the 9 remaining Chinese fast attack boats hit their maximum speed, their catamarans leaping off the crests of the swells. On the bridge of the USS Holly, the tactical officer watched the range indicator drop into the red. The time for proportional response had passed. Could the destroyer's short-range defenses stop a saturated wave of 9 boats charging from 3 different directions at once? The air around the ship was a thick gray haze of cordite and diesel exhaust. The The sea once blue was now choked with the black, oily slicks of the 5 vessels already sent to the bottom. Final warning transmitted on the Brigetto Bridge. Sir, the communications officer reported, his voice tight. No response. They're ignoring all signals. They're locking their fire control radars onto our bridge structure. The commander of the Halley stood like a statue. They made their choice. Switch the Aegis system to auto special mode. Assign the 30mm cannons to the closest threats. We're not letting them get within 2 miles. The swarm was now executing a desperate high-speed maneuver known as the Claw. The 9 boats split into 3 distinct groups of 3. One group surged directly toward the Halley's bow, while the other 2 looped wide to the north and south, attempting to catch the 2 American destroyers in a deadly crossfire. The Chinese crews knew they were outgunned, but they were betting on the sheer volume of targets to confuse the American computers. On the deck of the Halley, the 2 Mark 38 25mm chain guns and the 30mm close-in cannons began to pivot. These were the ship's brawlers, fast-firing, stabilized weapons designed to shred small boats and low-flying threats. The barrels were already spinning, the high-pitched whine of the electric motors cutting through the sound of the wind. Through the thermal optics, the Chinese boats were bright white ghosts against the cold gray of the ocean. The American gunners could see the spray hitting the windshields of the enemy bridges. They could see the missile hatches on the Hube-class vessels cranking open, revealing the lethal canisters inside. Distance 3,500 yards, the sensor operator called out. The humidity in the air felt like a wet blanket, but the bridge was freezing. Sweat ran down the back of the tactical officer's neck, a cold trickle against his uniform. Every second felt like an hour. The radar screen was a chaotic dance of overlapping circles and vectors. The Halley and the Stetham were now firing their 5-inch guns at a frantic pace. The thud, thud, thud of the heavy shells vibrating through the hull every few seconds. They're turning. They're turning into their final launch profiles. The 3 boats in the northern group suddenly banked hard to the left, their hulls carving deep white scars into the water. This was the point of no return. In a naval engagement of this speed, you can replace this text with any text you wish. You can either write in this text box or paste your own text here. Try different languages and voices. Change the speed and the pitch of the voice. You can even tweak the SML, speech synthesis markup language, to control how the different sections of the text sound. Click on SSML above to give it a try. Enjoy using text-to-speech. There were no second chances. If the destroyers failed to break the swarm in the next 60 seconds, the air would be filled with 18 more supersonic missiles at point-blank range. Stetham reports they are engaging the southern group with everything they have. The executive officer shouted over the roar of a nearby missile launch. The Halley was now alone against center and northern groups. 6 boats versus 1 destroyer. The commander gripped the railing of the bridge console. He could see the lead boat of the center group, clearly now the number painted on its bow. The spray flying off its twin hulls, the dark shadows of the crew behind the glass. There within 3,000 yards, the weapon controller said, his hand hovering over the fire command. Permissions are green across the board. Wait for the lock, the commander said, his voice eerily calm. Make every round count. The silence on the bridge was absolute for 3 heartbeats. Then the computer chimed, a steady high-pitched tone that signaled the Aegis system had achieved a perfect firing solution on all 6 approaching targets. The swarm had entered the inner layer of the American shield. Commence firing, the commander ordered. The Halley erupted. The 30mm cannons on the port side began to cycle at 200 rounds per minute. The sound was not a series of shots, but a continuous mechanical scream that shook the very foundations of the ship. Tracers, bright red and blinding in the afternoon sun, reached out across the water like glowing fingers, searching for the lead Chinese boat. The engagement had reached its most violent phase. The trigger was squeezed. On the port side of the USS Halley, the 30mm cannon shrieked into life. A white column of fire punching backward through the humid air. The heat blast from the muzzle washed across the faces of the sailors on the bridge wing, stinging their skin with the scent of ozone and burnt metal. The sound was not a series of shots, but a continuous bone-shaking roar that blotted out the wind and the sea. A stream of glowing red tracers reached out across the 2,000 yards of open water, tracking the lead Chinese boat with surgical precision. The 70-pound shells from the 5-inch gun slammed into the lead catamaran first. The high-explosive warhead punched clean through the thin aluminum hull of the bridge, detonating the fuel lines stored just below the deck. The boat did not just stop. It erupted instantly into a jagged tower of orange flame and black smoke. 6 tons of twisted steel rose 3 m into the air before the hull split along the weld seams and fell back into the churning wake. The explosion was so violent it sent a physical shock wave through the air that rattled the Holly's bridge windows. 2 seconds later, the 30mm rounds found the second boat in the center group. The armor-piercing incendiary shells shredded the forward decal like paper, chewing through the missile canisters. A secondary detonation followed immediately, a brilliant white flash that bleached the sky for a single heartbeat. The boat's magazine cooked off in a chain reaction, sending burning debris flying 500 feet in every direction. There was no time for the crew to eject or jump. The vessel simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding ring of fire and floating wreckage. The third boat attempted to bank hard to the left, its engine screaming in a desperate effort to escape the wall of fire, but the Holly's computer had already predicted the turn. A final volley from the 25mm chain gun rayed the length of the hull, severing the steering cables and puncturing the main fuel tank. The boat slowed to a crawl, its stern engulfed in a thick, oily fire that rose 20 feet into the air. It wallowed in the swells, a broken predator that had run out of time. The ocean was a chaos of fire and salt spray. Black smoke boiled out of the 3 burning wrecks, creating a wall of smog that obscured the remaining boats. The heat was intense, a searing weight that could be felt even across the water. The sea was littered with jagged fragments of aluminum and the dark, spreading stain of diesel fuel. The 3 lead vessels of the Supply Light Center Group were gone, destroyed in less than 15 seconds of concentrated American fire. The bridge of the Holly remained a tomb of silent professional focus. The only sound was the mechanical hum of the consoles and the distant thud of the Stethem's guns engaging the southern flank. The commander did not celebrate. He watched the digital display as the red icons for the first 3 boats flickered and turned gray. He knew the fight was only half over. The northern and southern groups were still closing, and they had seen what happened to their leaders. Center group neutralized. The weapon controller reported, his voice flat and steady. Shifting fire to the northern group. Range 2,500 yards. Shifting fire to the northern group. Range 2,500 yards. The Holly's hull groaned as the ship turned hard to starboard, leaning into the curve at 30 knots. The wake was a mountain of white foam cutting through the black oil slicks of the dead boats. The air was thick with the chemical bite of burning propellant and the smell of the sea. The remaining Chinese boats were now moving into their final frantic attack patterns, their own missiles already in the air. The silence on the bridge lasted exactly 3 seconds before the next alarm began to scream. The enemy was reacting now, their formations breaking apart in panic as they realized the scale of the destruction. They were no longer a coordinated swarm. They were individual hunters trying to survive a storm of steel that they had never expected. Detecting multiple incoming launches from the northern group, the sensor operator yelled, "Brace, brace, brace." The sky was suddenly filled with the white smoke trails of incoming missiles, diving low over the water to stay beneath the radar. The Hoy was now the center of a circle of fire. The second half of the battle was beginning, and the margin for error had vanished into the smoke of the first 3 kills. The northern group of 3 Chinese boats saw the center group vanish in a wall of fire. They reacted instantly with the desperation of cornered predators. They did not retreat or turn back toward the coast. Instead, They banked hard to the north, their catamaran hulls tilting at dangerous angles. As they tried to put distance between themselves and the Holly's radar, the crews were in a state of visible panic. They began firing their remaining missiles in a blind, uncoordinated spray. The white smoke from their launchers clouded the humid air, mixing with the black soot of the dead ships, already sinking behind them. The lead boat of the northern group kicked its rudders hard over. It skipped across the 2-meter swells like a flat stone. The captain was trying to find a gap in the American defense, but the Holly's close-in weapon system was already tracking him. The 20mm Gatling gun screamed into life. It fired 75 rounds of tungsten every single second. The sound was like a giant piece of industrial silk being ripped in half by a god. The stream of tracers reached out and found the lead boat. The rounds chewed through the lightweight aluminum and fiberglass of the forward deck. They found the primary fuel line and the forward magazine in the same microcont. The boat did not just explode. It came apart in 1,000 jagged pieces. The heat blast from the detonation washed across the water, vaporizing the salt spray. The engine block, weighing 2 tons, flew 200 feet into the air before hitting the ocean with a massive white splash. Debris rained down for 300 yards. The remaining 2 boats in the northern group veered sharply to avoid the falling steel. Wet smell of salt mixed with the sharp bite of high explosives. The automated defenses of the destroyer were now the only thing standing between the crew and a catastrophic hit. Vampire point 1 me. Engage, the tactical action officer screamed into his headset. On the aft deck of the Holly, the failing close-in weapon system, a white dome-shaped mount that sailors called R2, D2, came to life with terrifying speed. It did not sound like a gun. It sounded like a massive piece of industrial canvas being ripped apart by a god. It fired 20mm armor-piercing tungsten sabots at a rate of 4,500 rounds per minute. The stream of fire was a solid line of red light reaching out into the twilight, searching for the first incoming missile. The lead Chinese missile was less than 500 yards away when the wall of tungsten found it. The warhead detonated prematurely, creating a massive explosion that sent a wall of fire and jagged fragments skipping across the water like stones. The Holly shuddered as the shock wave slammed into the hull, the steel groaning under the pressure. The second missile, blinded by the debris of the first, veered sharply upward. The Holly's cram launcher on the forward deck fired a single-rim 116 missile that intercepted the threat 300 yards out, turning it into a rain of harmless sparks. The bridge was a chaos of red lights and vibrating glass. The commander gripped the handles of his chair, his teeth gritted against the violent shaking of the ship. Every time the close-in weapon system fired, the entire bridge structure vibrated so hard it was impossible to read the displays. The smell of ozone, the scent of high-voltage electricity was everywhere. Third missile splashed. The fourth is tracking the Stetham, the sensor operator yelled. 2 miles to the starboard quarter, the USS Stetham was fighting its own battle. Its own close-in weapon system was a strobe light of orange fire in the deepening dark. The final Chinese missile was low, almost touching the water. Hidden by the spray and the smoke of the burning boats, the Stethem's gunners didn't wait for the computer. They rad the surface of the water with 25mm chain guns, creating a literal wall of splashing water and lead. The missile hit a column of water, tumbled, and skipped twice before, exploding a mere 50 yards from the Stethem's hull. A mountain of gray water and black smoke rose beside the Stetham, drenching the entire flight deck. The ship disappeared for 3 seconds behind the spray. When it emerged, it was listing 5 degrees to the port side, but its lights were still on and its guns were still tracking. Stetham reports minor topside damage. No huit penetrations. All vampires are down, the communications officer reported, his voice shaking with a mix of terror and relief. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The mechanical screaming of the guns had stopped, replaced by the low, steady hum of the ventilation fans trying to clear the smoke from the bridge. The commander stood up, his legs feeling like lead. He looked out the port window. The ocean was a graveyard. 14 Hube-class boats had been reduced to floating charcoal and jagged aluminum. The fire from the largest wreck rose 50 feet into the air, casting a flickering hellish light across the water. Damage control parties report, the commander ordered. Throughout the ship, sailors in heavy fire retardant suits moved through the darkened passageways with flashlights. They checked the weld seams, the fuel lines, and the ammunition hoists. The Holly had taken hundreds of fragments from the near misses. The superstructure was peppered with holes the size of quarters, and the forward radar array was cracked. But the ship was alive. On the deck, the gunner's mates began the grim work of clearing the jammed casings. Clearing the jammed casings from the 30mm cannons. The barrels were glowing a dull, cherry red, the heat radiating off the metal in visible waves. The smell of burnt paint and hot oil was nauseating. One sailor dropped the spent casing, and the sound of the brass hitting the deck was the loudest thing in the world. Bridge combat. We are picking up a new signal. Long-range search radar from the mainland. They know their swarm is gone. The commander looked at the digital clock on the bulkhead. It had been exactly 12 minutes since the first shot was fired. In that time, hundreds of millions of dollars of hardware and over 100 enemy sailors had vanished into the South China Sea. Come to course 090, the commander said. Increase speed to 32 knots. We're getting out of this box before the aircraft arrive. Signal the Stetham to form up on our stern. We move now. The two destroyers turned away from the burning wreckage, their wakes cutting a white path through the oil-choked water. They were leaving behind a field of fire and silence racing against the clock as the Chinese military began to scramble its response from the coast. The engagement was over, but the war for the South China Sea was just beginning. 6:45 in the evening. The South China Sea. The USS Holly turned its nose toward the last flickering shadows on the water. Two Chinese catamarans were still afloat, though they were no longer fighting. One was listing 45 degrees to the port side, its engines dead, and its deck awash with the dark, oily waves of the Pacific. The other was a hollowed-out shell, its bridge a jagged ruin of melted glass and blackened steel. The tropical twilight had turned the ocean into a sheet of hammered lead, reflecting the orange glow of the fires that refused to go out. Targets 7 and 9 are still buoyant, sir. The tactical action officer reported. They're drifting toward the reef. Sensors detect internal fires, but the missile canisters appear intact. The commander of the Holly looked at the thermal display. The two wrecks were glowing white-hot against the cooling sea. He could not leave them there. If those missile canisters were salvaged, the intelligence loss would be severe. More importantly, there remained a navigation hazard in a contested waterway. The air was thick with the heavy, wet smell of tropical rain, mixing with the acrid stink of burnt aluminum and diesel fuel. Finish them, the commander said, his voice a low rasp. 30mm only. We need to conserve the 5 inches ammunition. The port side 30mm cannon on the Holly began to track the first wreck. The electric motor winded, a high-pitched sound that cut through the low rumble of the ship's engines. The weapon controller adjusted the joystick, placing the green crosshairs directly on the waterline of the crippled catamaran. The distance was 1,000 yards. The sea was running a 2M swell, making the target dance in the optics. The cannon barked in 3 round bursts. The sound was a rhythmic mechanical thud, thud, thud that vibrated through the deck plates. The armor-piercing, incendiary rounds punched through the thin hull of the Chinese boat like needles through paper. White sparks erupted where the shells struck the metal, followed immediately by small, jagged secondary explosions. The waterline was shredded, the structural ribs of the boat snapping under the kinetic force of the 30mm slugs. The first wreck groaned as the sea rushed into the new holes. It rolled slowly to the left, the mast snapping as it hit the water. With a final bubbling hiss, the boat disappeared beneath the surface, leaving behind nothing but a swirling vortex of white foam and a few floating crates. The Holly shifted its fire to the second wreck. This boat was already burning from bow to stern. As the 30mm rounds struck the aft deck, they found a pocket of unspent fuel. A fireball 50 feet wide erupted into the darkening sky, silhouetting the Holly in a hellish orange light. The heat was so intense the paint on the wreck's hull began to peel and curl like burning paper. The boat shattered under the pressure of the blast, sinking in two separate pieces that hissed as the ocean swallowed the fire. Both targets confirmed destroyed. The sensor operator announced the water was now a graveyard of floating debris. Thousands of pieces of fiberglass, aluminum, and insulation bobbed in the wake of the two American destroyers. The smell of the engagement, the iron scent of blood, the chemical bite of propellant, and the hot breath of the engines seemed to hang in the windless air. The sun had finally vanished, leaving the world in a deep sapphire blue darkness. Bridge combat. Long-range radar is picking up high-speed air contacts launching from the mainland. Estimate arrival in 12 minutes. The commander did not hesitate. The mission was done. 14 boats were at the bottom of the sea. The cost to the enemy was total, but the Hornet's nest had been thoroughly poked. The Hoy and the Stetham were now the most hunted objects in the South China Sea. Increase speed to 35 knots, the commander ordered. All hands to Condition 2. We are running for deep water. Secure the guns and prepare for high-speed transit. The two destroyers dug their sterns into the water, their massive propellers churning the sea into a mountain of white spray. They leaned into a hard turn to the east, their gray holes disappearing into the gathering night behind them. The only evidence of the battle was the cooling slicks of oil and the distant fading glow of the fires on the horizon. The hunt was over and the escape had begun. The night was absolute. The USS Holly and the USS Stetham were no longer ships of war. They were shadows moving at 35 knots through a world of ink and salt. The vibration of the four gas turbine engines was a constant bone-shaking hum that reached into every corner of the hull. On the flight deck, the wind screamed past the superstructure at 40 miles per hour, carrying away the last lingering smells of cordite and burnt aluminum. In the Combat Information Center, the blue light of the consoles illuminated faces that were pale and slick with sweat. The high-intensity adrenaline of the last 20 minutes was fading, replaced by a heavy, crushing fatigue. The tactical action officer adjusted his headset, his eyes scanning the long-range radar. The Chinese air contact were still 50 miles out, but they were loitering, searching for the two ghosts that had just erased their literal fleet. The air inside the ship was cold, but it felt stagnant, heavy with the collective breath of 300 men and women who had just looked into the face of a different kind of ending. Bridge combat. We are entering the squall line in 3 minutes. Radar cross-section will be minimized by the rain, the tactical officer reported. Copy that, the commander replied. He was standing by the port bridge wing door, looking back at the western horizon. There was no fire visible anymore. The ocean had swallowed the evidence. The fires quenched by thousands of tons of cedar. Maintain 35 knots. Secure all non-essential limites. We go dark. We go dark. The Holly's electronic warfare suite went silent. The ship was now a passive observer, listening to the electronic screams of the searching aircraft. To the north, the Chinese pilots were burning through their fuel, their radars sweeping empty water in a frantic search for the destroyers. The two American ships were heading for the deep trenches of the Philippine Sea, where the water was 4 miles deep and the acoustic signatures of the hulls would be lost in the complex thermal layers of the deep ocean. Below decks, the damage control teams were finishing their final rounds. The Holly had taken hundreds of fragments from the near misses of the anti-ship missiles. The superstructure was scarred, the gray paint scorched and peeled in places where the heat of the explosions had been most intense. The portside lifeboats were shredded and several antennas were bent at impossible angles, but the pressure hull was intact. On the Stetham, a small fire in the auxiliary machinery room had been extinguished with no casualties. The two ships were wounded, but they remained fast and fully mission-capable. The commander walked to the center of the bridge and picked up the secure handset. It was time to tell the world what had happened. Flash message to 7th Fleet Commander, he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion pulling at his eyes. Engagement complete. 14 hostiles contact neutralised. No American casualties. Polly and Stetham are clear of the engagement zone and proceeding to Point Alpha, requesting overhead cover at sunrise. The words were simple, clinical, and final. There was no mention of the wall of fire, the mechanical screaming of the 30mm cannons, or the way the Chinese catamarans had disintegrated under the weight of American steel. That was for the formal after-action reports and the analysts in Hawaii. For now, the only thing that mattered was the distance between the ships and the mainland. The rain hit the bridge windows. Suddenly, a heavy tropical downpour that turned the world into a blur of gray water. The Holly leaned into a slight swell, the bow lifting and then smashing down into the trough with a violent spray of white foam. The sound of the rain on the armored glass blotted out the hum of the electronics, providing a natural shield for the two hunters as they slipped away. On the mess decks, the crews were finally standing down. They sat in silence, drinking lukewarm coffee and staring at the deck plates. They were the same sailors who had woken up that morning for what they thought was a routine transit. Now, they were veterans of surface engagement that would be studied in naval mines for decades. They didn't feel like heroes. They felt the cold, the hunger, and the sudden, heavy weight of survival. The commander looked out at the dark water through the rain. The South China Sea was behind them. The battle had been short, violent, and decisive. The 14 boats were at the bottom, and the 2 American destroyers were still standing, their flags whipping in the dark wind. 12 minutes of combat, the executive officer whispered, looking at his watch as if he couldn't believe the time. It felt like a lifetime. It was long enough, the commander said. He looked at the radar one last time. The screen was clear. The enemy had lost the scent in the storm. Steer course 085. Let's go home. The Holly and the Stetham vanished into the rain and the night. 2 gray ghosts leaving nothing behind but a fading wake in a sea that never remembers.